Pesachim, Daf from Samach Test through Ayin Hey. First mission in the parak had said, Klal Amar Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said a principle, a malacha, in the context of Karban Pesach, that you can do before Shabbos, you can do on Erev Shabbos. That's not Docha Shabbos. The Pesach itself is Docha Shabbos. Shchita, shechting the Pesach, you can't do on Erev Shabbos, it has to be done on Erev Pesach. That's what's Docha Shabbos. The Gemara here says, Rabbi Yehuda Marav says, halacha Rabbi Akiva. And then it says, Rabbi Akiva says the same thing in the context of Mila. Rabbi Akiva says, malacha that you could have done Me'erev Shabbos. The Mila falls out on Shabbos, the 8th day is on Shabbos, so machshirin, preparations for the Mila, preparing the knife and so on, that you can do on Erev Shabbos, they don't have to be done on the day of the Mila. They're not Docha Shabbos. Mila itself, Mila has to be done on the 8th day. Mila can't be done on Erev Shabbos when the 8th day is on Shabbos. So Mila itself is Docha Shabbos, we paskin like Rabbi Akiva. It's surprisingly unclear, it seems, in the early poskim, whether this principle, that only the Mila is Docha Shabbos, but machshirin of Mila, preparing the knife and so on, since they can be done Erev Shabbos, are not Docha Shabbos, what about a case where they can't be done on Erev Shabbos? What about a case where you prepared the machshirin and something went wrong, and the knife was destroyed, you have to make a new knife? What happens in a case where, for an onus, something came up, a matter of life and death, and you were unable to prepare the thing that you need for Shabbos, for the Pesach, for the Mila? Are machshirin then Docha Shabbos? So it's not clear. There are a number of poskim who seem to imply that machshirin are never Docha Shabbos. On the other hand, there are some poskim who seem to indicate that if it's not your fault, if you try to do it Erev Shabbos and you were unable to, then it would be Docha Shabbos. They bring from the Klal Mila of the Ri HaGozer that if the knife was damaged on Shabbos, you can be Docha Shabbos. It's not your fault. You prepared a knife. The knife got damaged. You could then you could prepare the knife on Shabbos. Interesting case. Chief Rabbi David Lau has a case of a child who was jaundiced. He was too jaundiced to do the Milah. So before Shabbos, you checked his jaundice levels scientifically, medically, and he was too jaundiced for the Milah on Erev Shabbos. Now, but it was borderline, and the medical opinion was that on Shabbos the jaundice may recede to the point at which you can do the Milah. But you have to test. We want to make sure that the jaundice is low enough. It's a blood test, and it involves Chilul Shabbos. So the question is, can you do the test on Shabbos? Doing a blood test is a malacha of Shabbos. The question is, can you do the blood test by a Jew, by a non-Jew? Can you do the blood test to allow the Milah? It's machshirin. You certainly can't do, Rabbi Lau points out, you certainly can't do the Milah if you don't know if he still has too much jaundice for Milah. So you can't do the Milah without the test, but the test is machshirin. But it's machshirin, you couldn't have done Erev Shabbos. You did do it Erev Shabbos. You tested him Erev Shabbos and it was still too high, but it might have gone down on Shabbos. So he goes back and forth on this question of whether there would be basis to allow this test on Shabbos, because even though it's machshirin, it's a sort of machshirin that there's no way you could have done it before Shabbos. You need an up-to-the-minute test to determine whether the Milah can be done on Shabbos. His conclusion is that we can't allow the test by Yidei Yisrael, for a Jew to perform the test, actual Chilul Shabbos we can't do. By a non-Jew, he says there is basis to be lenient, but he's reluctant to paskin entirely leniently. He says we have to ask the Gedolei HaPoskim. Shabbos is very stringent, and certainly Pikuach Nefesh is stringent. So either way, to do the Milah without the test, you're certainly not going to do. To allow Chilul Shabbos requires broad shoulders, so he's not entirely sure. On Daf Ayin, the Gemara says that Ben Tema, the Tana Ben Tema says that the Karban Chagiga, which is brought with the Pesach, has halachas similar to that of the Pesach. And the Gemara discusses, so first the Gemara says it's only nechal liyom v'layla. It has the shortened period of time you can eat it like only liyom v'layla. But the Gemara says, according to Ben Tema, does it have the halacha of tzli or not? Does it have to be roasted like the Karban Pesach? Ordinary karbanos can be prepared in various ways. Karban Pesach, eino nechal ela tzli. Of course, the Gemara goes on at length, it has to be roasted. What about the Chagiga? So according to Ben Tema, according to other Tanaim, that there's no connection between the Pesach and Chagiga, then of course the Chagiga doesn't have to be tzli. But according to Ben Tema, maybe the connection between the Pesach and tzli is strong enough that the Chagiga also has to have tzli or not. The Gemara said maybe not. Maybe only the Zman Achila is like the Pesach. The time frame you can eat it is like the Pesach. Maybe tzli is not required. So the Gemara says, The Manishtana, the Gemara quotes the Mishnah that gives us the Manishtana. The Mishnah's Manishtana is not exactly the same as the one we recite today. The Mishnah has a question about Shebachal Halelos, we can eat meat prepared in various ways. We eat basar tzli, roasted, shalok, one type of cooking, levushal, ordinary cooking. Shalok is overcooked, they translate it. Halai lazeh, kulo tzli. Tonight, everything is tzli. It's all tzli. So the Gemara says, that Mishnah, that Rav Chisda says, that Mishnah seems to be according to Bentema. Zu divrei Bentema. Bentema says everything is tzli, not just the Pesach, even the Chagiga. So halai lazeh, kulo tzli, that's the Shita of Bentema. Just like we say, halai lazeh, kulo matzah, everything we eat is matzah. According to Bentema, everything we eat is tzli. Karan Pesach, Karan Chagiga. So you see that the Bentema says that the Chagiga has to be tzli, and apparently the Mishnah is going according to Bentema. Tosfos wonders why the Gemara doesn't bring that later. That's the Gemara relies on saying it over here. The Achronim ask on the Rambam. The Rambam does not seem to paskin like Bentema. The Rambam, in certain points, the Rambam seems to paskin not like Bentema. Yet he does bring the version of the Manishtana in the Mishnah. Halayla zeh kulo tzli, and that our Gemara seems to say that's only according to Bentema. So which is it? Do we paskin like Bentema? Do we not paskin like Bentema? So the Chazon Ish says that even though our Gemara says that Halayla zeh kulo tzli is going according to Bentema, it's not really compelling. Really, the Gemara later in the Masechta doesn't bring this because really the Mishnah can be explained differently. But the language of kulo tzli, the Chazon Ish suggests, means normally you cut up a lamb and the lamb has different parts, and some parts would taste better roasted and some parts would taste better cooked and prepared in other ways. So b'chol halelos, we eat meat, the same animal, we break it up and we eat some parts tzli and some parts not tzli. Halayla zeh kulo tzli, the entire lamb has to be roasted, even parts that might normally be prepared differently. Halayla zeh kulo tzli. But it doesn't have to mean that all the meat of the night of Pesach, even the Chagiga, has to be eaten tzli. Meiri says, when we say in the Haggadah, we don't say it today, but when we say in the Haggadah, Halayla zeh kulo tzli, either that's not lahalacha, that Mishnah is not going aliba de hilchasa, or he says that it means, again, similar to the Chazon Ish, that when it says tzli, it means to the Karban Pesach, that halayla zeh, kulo, the whole Karban Pesach has to be tzli. There's rules, it's restricted, only tzli, but not all the meat of the night. Rav Chisda said it meant all the meat, both the Pesach and the Chagiga, and the Meiri and the Chazon Ish are saying that it means kulo tzli, the Karban Pesach has to be tzli. We don't say this in our Manishtana. Rabbeinu Yerucham says that B'zman hazeh, we don't say b'chol halelos, we eat meat, roasted, cooked, shalok, and tonight all kulo tzli, because we don't have b'avonosenu, due to our sins, pnei chataenu, galina me'artzenu, we don't have the Karban Pesach. The Karban Pesach is the animal that's only tzli. On the contrary, we don't eat tzli on the night of Pesach. So therefore, we don't say that phrase in the Manishtana. The Rashash later asks, what does it mean kulo tzli? Kulo tzli, everything is tzli. According to the Rav Chisda's explanation, everything, both the Pesach and the Chagiga. Fine, maybe the Chagiga has to be tzli. You're allowed to have a roast on Pesach night. We don't do that. Our minhag is we don't eat roasted meat. We discussed previously. But Medina de Gemara, you're allowed for Shulchan Aruch, for the Suda, you're allowed to eat meat, and that meat can be roasted if you want. Again, we don't do that, but you can. That meat can be cooked. That we do today. We have corned beef. We have other types of beefs. We have meat to prepare other ways as well. So what do you mean kulo tzli? Even if you say like Bentema that the Chagiga has to be tzli, you're allowed to have ordinary meat that's not tzli. So what does kulo tzli mean? So the Rashash explains that we're referring to the ka'ara, the seder plate that has the specific mitzvahs of the Yom Tov. It has the marar, it has the charoses, you have the matzah there. So the question of Manishtana is the mitzvahs hayom, not all the food of Pesach night. I'm referring specifically to the mitzvahs hayom. The mitzvahs hayom, the meat that we have on the Seder plate, the meat that we have as part of the ritual of the Seder, that's kulo tzli. But it doesn't mean, of course, that all the meat on the Seder night is tzli. Of course not. You can have boiled meat and other types of meat on Pesach night as well. Tosfos makes a similar point. Tosfos says that two of the questions have the word kulo in them. All other nights of the year we eat chametz and matzah, halayla zeh, kulo matzah. That's certainly true. We eat other things other than matzah. We eat potatoes and we eat chicken soup. But all the bread, all the bread-like things are matzah. That's fine. We also say tzli, halayla zeh, kulo tzli. That's what we've just been discussing. When it comes to marar, however, we say shebachal halelos, we eat sha'ar yirakos, halai lahazeh marar. And the Rishonim say the Girsa is not kula marar, halai lahazeh is marar. We don't say kula marar. Tosha says, why not? So you could have said because you eat a whole suda with chicken soup and potato kugel and other things. But again, like we saw in the Rashash, that kulo doesn't refer to everything you eat all night. You can eat boiled meat at night also, and we still say kulo tzli in the time of the Mishnah. Kulo means everything on the Seder plate. So on the Seder plate, we don't just have carrots and celery and tomatoes. We don't have all kinds of vegetables on the Seder plate. So why don't we say kulo marar? So Tosfos says, because we eat shar yirakos b'tibul rishon. Tibul rishon, the first dipping, what we call karpas, is not marar. We dip other things into karpas. We dip potatoes or celery or whatever it is that we dip. So even when we're referring to the Seder plate, it's still not kulo marar because we have something else that we use for karpas. So kulo matzah, certainly kulo matzah is easy. Kulo tzli, which we don't say bisman hazeh, kulo tzli refers to the current Pesach, and according to Rav Chisda, also the Chagiga. According to the Chazon Ish and the Meiri, the way they explain the Mishnah, according to other opinions, kulo tzli refers specifically to the animal of the Karban Pesach. That animal is brought kulo tzli. And marar, we don't say kulo because marar, we're going to be eating the vegetable of the karpas, and that's part of the mitzvah. That's on the Seder plate, and that's still not marar, so we don't say kulo marar. On Daf Ayin Aleph, beginning of Ayin Aleph, the Gemara has a statement, begins on the end of Daf Ayin. The Gemara says that if you have a shlamim, a carbon shlamim, that you shechter on Erev Yom Tov, you're not yotzi the mitzvah of simcha. There's a special mitzvah of simcha, which we fulfill by bringing karbanos and enjoying the meat, and you're also not yotzi the mitzvah of chagiga, the carbon, the shlamim that you shechter on Erev Yom Tov. The Gemara has a discussion, why not? For both these halachas, you're not yotzi simcha, you're not yotzi chagiga. So why not chagiga? Simcha has its own reason, but why you're not yotzi chagiga with the shlamim that you shechter on Erev Yom Tov? So the Gemara says, because chagiga is davar shebachova. Chagiga is a carbon that you're obligated to bring. B'chol davar shebachova ein abayel min. A davar shebachova, a carbon that you're obligated to bring, can only be brought min hachulin, and the shlamim is not chulin. Now the Gemara has this principle in various places, and the context is karbanos. The context is a carbon that's a chova cannot be brought from something that is not chulin. Again, chulin means not kachim, or not other types of, maybe not other types of sanctified, maybe not maser or truma, but it's a din that refers in the Talmud to carbon, and it can't be brought from food or from animals that has a different halachic status, like kachim of ishlamim, or maybe maser or other things. Some poskim apply this to other halachas that are relevant bisman hazeh as well. There's a famous ruling of the Maril, which is brought by all the later poskim. The Maril was asked if a person can fulfill, it's going to be Purim soon, whether a person can fulfill the mitzvah of matanas levyonim by giving maser, by which he meant maser ksafim, the maser we take off our income today. Can a person fulfill matanas levyonim with maser money? Maril says no, he thinks not. And the reason he gives is because it's davar shebachova, and he gives various arguments, but he seems to invoke our principle. He says it's davar shebachova, ein abayel min achulin. A davar shebachova, matanas levyonim is a chova, ein abayel min achulin, and it can't come from maser. So, and maser includes maser ksafim. This is brought by the later Acharonim, Mishnah Berurah, and others, that you can't fulfill matanas levyonim with maser money. Poskim say that refers to the basic obligation of matanas levyonim, however much that is. If you want to give extra matanas levyonim, kol hakavod, give that for maser if you want. But at least the basic sum that you fulfill the mitzvah matanas levyonim with, that cannot come from maser ksafim, the poskim say, and the Maril says, because of the principle of our Gemara of davar shebachova, something which you have an obligation to bring, ein haba ela min achulin. The Tshuvas Pnei Yeshua, though, challenges this type of logic. He wasn't discussing the Maril, he was discussing a different case. The Tshuvas Pnei Yeshua was discussing, there was a community that had a custom, it required people to buy mitzvahs. We sell aliyah, tzatza b'achnasa, and opening the aron, different things. So they used to sell mitzvahs in that community, and there was an obligation that a person had to buy. The community would assess, you have to buy a certain number of mitzvahs per year, a certain amount, however they established the level of the obligation. The question was, can you spend maser money to fulfill those obligations, to buy those mitzvahs? So the Tshuvas Pnei Yeshua says, his correspondent had wanted to argue like the Maril. It's davar shebachova. Once you've been assessed a formal binding obligation by the community to purchase these mitzvahs, it becomes davar shebachova, ein haba min achulin. Just like Maril said, you can't give matanas levyonim with maser ksafim money, so too the Tshuvas Pnei Yeshua's correspondent said that you can't buy these mitzvahs with Maser Ksafim money. Says the Tshuvas Pnei Yeshua and Itama, that's a completely incorrect analogy. He says, for two reasons. He says, first of all, as we alluded to earlier, Davar Shebachova in the Talmudic context refers to a carbon. We learn from Carbon Pesach, it says Bakar V'tzon. The Gemara darshans anything which is supposed to be brought from Bakar V'tzon, different types of karbanos which are brought from Bakar and Tzon, from cattle and sheep, Ein Abayal and Achulin. It's limited to karbanos. It doesn't apply to obligations like buying mitzvahs paying tzedakah to the community. That has nothing to do with Bakar V'tzon. Furthermore, he says, even if you're talking about a real carbon, he says, even if you'd be talking about a carbon in the time of Chazal, you can't bring a carbon if it's already a shlamim. That's not called ba'am and achulin. If it's maser, that's not chulin. Maser ksafim, he says, it's a mitzvah to give maser ksafim, a minhag, a takana, a din daraisa, whatever it is. But maser ksafim, he says, is chulin. The maser that you took in the Torah, maser, that certain types of maser have the status of have a kedusha, have a halachic status to them. But our maser is chulin. It's chulin gemurim. It's a mitzvah to give it to the aniyim, he says. So he says both halves of this argument, calling the modern obligation of tzedakah to a shul or to matanis lavyonim, calling that davar shebachova is not correct. It may be a chova in the sense of obligation, but it's not what the Gemara means by chova, which is a carbon obligation. And B, trying to say eina ba'alam and achulin and saying maser ksafim is not chulin is also not correct. Maser ksafim is bona fide chulin. So the Tshuvas Pnei Yeshua rejects this argument. Nevertheless, when it comes to matanis lavyonim, the later poskim, the major poskim, all bring the maril that you're not allowed to fulfill matanis lavyonim with maser ksafim money, and the source is however we understand the analogy. The source is the principle of our Gemara, davar shebachova ein haba elam elachul. On Daf Ayin Beis, the Gemara brings a Mishnah. It says a Kohen is doing the avoda, and then he finds out he's actually not a legitimate Kohen. He's a Ben Grusha or Ben Chalutza. He has a problem with his parentage. He does descend from Aaron HaKohen, but there was a psul. One of the Kohanim in his ancestry married a woman he's not allowed to marry, so he's a chalal. So a chalal can't do the avoda. So normally if a chalal does the avoda is psula, because he's not a legitimate Kohen. However, if he did the avoda in good faith and then discovered his chalal status after the fact, the Gemara brings him a Machlokes Tanaim. The Mishnah says, the Chum say, Tanakama says psulin. Rabbi Shua machshir. The Gemara says, why is Rabbi Shua machshir? Because the pasuk in V'zos HaBracha, the bracha of Moshe to Shevet Levi, it says, K'mecha v'orech l'esh chasidecha, and then it says, Barech Hashem chelo po'al yadav tirtze. Hashem will bless his valor, and po'al yadav, the work of his hands, God will give ritzu, God will accept. Rashi explains, previously it says, Yisimu Ketara ba'apecha, they'll offer Ketaras, and then it says, Baruch Hashem chelo. Chelo means valor, but we darshan chalalim, that if a chalal does the avoda, again, it means if a chalal does the avoda in good faith, then the avoda retroactively is not nifsal. We don't have the avoda today, but a very important, very interesting application of this Gemara is made in a famous tshuva of the Chasam Sofer. In the 19th century, when Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher, the Dorish Tzion, tried to reinstate, spearheaded a movement to reinstate the service in the temple, that he felt we could bring karbanos b'zman hazeh. There was a great and glorious correspondence and debate between the Rabbanim of Europe, many of the great Rabbanim of Europe, Rabbi Kiveger, the Chasam Sofer, and the number of other Gedolei poskim of that time, discussing all kinds of reasons why it would or would not be possible to bring karbanos. So one of the issue was, do we have reliable Kohanim? Maybe our Kohanim are really from Shevet Zvulun. Maybe their lineage is not so reliable. We don't have the proof, the levels of genealogical records that Chazal considered absolute gold standard proof. We rely on Chazakah, we rely on presumptions. So maybe that those presumptions are not strong enough to allow a putative Kohen to do the avoda. And moreover, even if he is genealogically a Kohen, maybe there's some kind of psul chalalos in his lineage. So many poskim were concerned about this. The Chasam Sofer was not. The Chasam Sofer said, even though it's true that many poskim in certain contexts said that we don't give a Kohen today challah or a truma because maybe he's not really a Kohen and shouldn't be eating challah and truma or is not entitled to challah and truma. Rabbi Yaakov Emden says that even though you do pidyon haben, you give the pidyon haben money to a Kohen, he shouldn't hold on to it, he should give it back because maybe he's not a Kohen. So you should do the mitzvah and give it to him, but he should feel that he might not be entitled to it, so he should give it back. The Chasam Sofer says it's true that these poskim were unsure about how reliable our Kohanim are, that means that they shouldn't keep money that you give them, that they shouldn't take Manas Kuna, or if they do, they should accept it for the mitzvah and then return it to you. However, the Chasam Sofer says, when it comes to doing the avoda, it's fine, because Pashtus, he's a Kohen, he looks like a Kohen. What are you worried about? Maybe something went wrong, maybe he's really not a Kohen. All right, so the Gemara says, Po'al Yadav Tertzeh, Baruch Hashem Chelo, Po'al Yadav Tertzeh. It turns out he's a Chalal, it's okay anyway. So, but Diavad Avoda is good. He's acting in good faith, but Diavad Avoda is good. What are you worried about? Maybe he's not a Kohen at all. Maybe one of his Kohen ancestors, his wife, had a child with somebody else. You're not choshesh for that. Rov Bilas Achar Abal, that for sure we can assume that there's a presumption of legitimacy, that the father is the very strong presumption in halacha that the husband is the father of the child. So what are you worried about? The mother became a halala, there was something wrong with the mother. All right, so the worst case scenario, he's a Kohen, but he's a halal. And our Gemara says that Paul Yadav Tertzeh, that Baruch Hashem Chela, Paul Yadav Tertzeh. So the Chasam Sofer says, therefore he's not concerned about Yichusei Kahuna, he's not concerned about the Yichus problems, the Avodah is fine. And he was actually very encouraging toward Rav Kalisher. He wrote a letter, he said, V'nochal sham v'napsachim al kolpanim, we'll be able to bring Karim Pesach, which is Hutra B'tzibur, as we discussed previously, and everything can be fine. So the Chasam Sofer was very sympathetic, in part because of our Gemara, to the project of bringing the Karbanos Bizman Hazeh. Some have argued, since Eliezer says, he wasn't really so supportive, it wasn't really Lamaisa, because the Arab rulers weren't going to let the Jews at that time, so he wasn't really writing a tshuva, absolute halacha Lamaisa, but what he actually wrote in his tshuva, in his published tshuva, is that in principle it would be okay, and he's not concerned with the problem of the Kohen being a Chalal, because of our Gemara, Baruch Hashem Chelo, Paul Yadav Tertzeh. On Daf Ayin Gimel, the Gemara discusses the principle of Toeh B'Dvar Mitzvah Potter. It's Machlokes Tanaim, but there's a principle, we had this earlier dafim as well. This is a principle in the halachas of carbon chatas, that normally a person who does an Aver B'Shogeg brings a carbon chatas, but in certain cases, if he's Toeh B'Dvar Mitzvah, if he's trying to do a mitzvah, even if something went wrong, even according to some, if it was loas a mitzvah, he didn't wind up doing the mitzvah, but if he was engaged in attempting to do a mitzvah, we say Toeh B'Dvar Mitzvah's potter, he does not bring a carbon. Now, the primary discussion in Chazal, the exclusive context of this, is karbanos. But there's a very interesting discussion in the Sholem Eshev. Sholem Eshev is discussing the laws of malpractice in halacha, medical malpractice. In Yeridea, there are halachas about malpractice. The Shulchan Aruch paskins, a person should make sure he knows what he's doing. He should be expert and certified before he practices. And in certain cases, he's chayav b'tashlumin. If he operated unauthorized, without rishus based in, he's chayav b'tashlumin, even if he is expert. In other cases, if he had rishus based in, he's pater, b'dinei adam, but he's still chayav b'dinei shemayim. He has a moral obligation. Based in can't enforce it, but he has an obligation b'dinei shemayim. And he's chayav galus. If he killed, he's chayav galus. If he unfortunately killed his patient, he's chayav galus, as Ritziach B'Shogeg. So the Sholem Eshev asks, what happened to the rule of Toeh B'Dvar Mitzvah? Afal B'Shalo as a mitzvah pater, according to some Tanaim at least, many Tanaim, even if you didn't wind up doing the mitzvah, the patient died, you didn't save him. But that's Toeh B'Dvar Mitzvah, it's a mitzvah to heal. Even though the Gemara says, Mikan Shenitin Rishus L'Rofei L'Rapos, it's a Rishus, but the poskim all say, in the Shulchan Aruch paskins, it starts out being a Rishus, but once it's a Rishus, it becomes a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah of saving lives. Hashavas Aveda, Shavas Gufa, Lo Samar Al Dam Reyacha. The Shulchan Aruch paskins, Nasna Torah Rishus L'Rofei L'Rapos, it's a mitzvah hu. B'chal B'kot Nefeshu, so it's a mitzvah. So if it's a mitzvah, why isn't it Toeh B'Dvar Mitzvah? Maybe he'll tell me, he says, that he's getting paid, so he's not doing it l'shem mitzvah. Not true, he says. A doctor is really not supposed to be paid. When he takes money, it's only called schar b'tela. So that's, he's not even being paid, he's just being paid for the opportunity cost, because he can't do other types of work. But it is a mitzvah, he says, so why shouldn't it be Toeh B'Dvar Mitzvah? He goes back and forth. He doesn't have a really good answer. He says maybe it's because if the patient died, you didn't even start doing the mitzvah. But he says no, maybe you started out doing the mitzvah. The initial portion of the treatment was successful, and then something went wrong, and he died. So that's classic Toeh B'Dvar Mitzvah. He doesn't really have a teretz. He says he eventually, after many years, he says he found this in the Sefer B'Samim Rosh, Shuvas B'Samim Rosh. Nenesi Ad Ma'od. He was overjoyed, he said, to find that his question was appeared in a Sefer. B'Samim Rosh is a controversial work, but he was happy to have found his question in the Sefer B'Samim Rosh. The Sholem Eshev's whole assumption is debatable. He's assuming that the principle of Toeh B'Dvar Mitzvah should apply in a civil law context, in the context of malpractice, That's not at all obvious. The contemporary Rabbanim ask on the Shalom Eshu that the Gemara talks about Aptur and carbon. If the halacha and carbon chatas, you're not chayav a chatas. It's one of the many halachas the Gemara tells us about the rules of carbon chatas. You're not chayav a carbon chatas if you're tab b'dvar mitzvah. But the poskim don't apply it. There's no precedent for applying it to civil questions. If you injure somebody else, adam muad la'olam, a person has strict liability for injury, then you're chayav. So the Shalom Eshu is making a remarkable assumption that the principle of tab b'dvar mitzvah should apply. Even the Shalom Eshu concedes that the halacha is not that. The halacha is that he's chayav in certain cases. But the idea is interesting. The Shalom Eshu assumed at least that the principle of tab b'dvar mitzvah should apply to a civil malpractice claim. Others point out that is, and that others counter that is an unwarranted assumption. On Daf Ayin Daled, the Gemara, the beginning of Perek Ketzad Solon, the halachos of how you roast the carbon Pesach. So it says you take a shpud, a spit of rimon, of wood from a pomegranate tree. That's what you use for the spit. You stick it through the Pesach, and that's how you roast it. The Gemara says, why not metal? Why not use a metal spit? Why dafka wood? So the Gemara says metal would be a problem. Metal would be a halachic problem because of the principle of cham miksaso, cham kulo. When metal gets hot, the heat spreads. Metal is a good conductor of heat. The heat spreads throughout the metal. And then, so the heat of the oven goes into the shpud, the spit, in the metal spit, and then the heat from the metal then roasts the Pesach, and that's not called tzliesh. Pesach has to be tzliesh, roasted from fire. If the metal absorbs the heat and then transmits it to the carbon, that's called tzli machmas davar acher, machmas the spit, and that is a problem. We don't have the current Pesach B'zman Hazeh, Rav Kalisher's best efforts notwithstanding, but the principle of cham mikzaso cham kulo appears in a variety of contexts in Yoreh De'ah. One context in which it's debated is if you stick a treif spoon into a pot, or you stick a milchik spoon into a fleshik pot. So normally the rule is we have to have shishim, we have to have 60 times the heter connected the isser, 60 times the milk connected the meat, and if not, it'll be usser. So if you drop the whole spoon in, then we're mashayar the total volume of the spoon. Measure displacement to the spoon, measure its volume, and that's how much you have to have 60 times that amount. But what if only half the spoon went in? What if only the bowl of the spoon went in? The handle didn't go in. What if only half of the bowl of the spoon went in? So do you have to measure 60 times the part that went in, or 60 times the whole spoon? So there are two opinions in the Shulchan Aruch. The first opinion says only that which went in. The second opinion says that if it's metal, you have to mishayar, you need 60 connected the whole spoon, because cham mikzaso cham kulo. So the heat conducts throughout the spoon, and then the blios from the whole spoon can go into the pot. The Ramah says, we don't paskin like that, tzvar rishona ikar. We don't apply cham mikzaso cham kulo in this case. Why not? The Shach explains, even though certainly we do paskin cham mikzaso cham kulo, that's true, that means the whole spoon is considered hot, even if only half went into the pot, or half went into the fire. But the blios from the other part of the spoon don't flow through the spoon, so the only blios that go into the pot are the blios of the portion of the spoon that went into the pot. Cham mikzaso cham kulo also comes up in the laws of Hagala, the laws of Kasher and Kalim. The Shulchan Aruch says that even though, because of the principle of cham mikzaso cham kulo, some say at least that if Isser came into contact with part of a keli, you had a pot, and you touched a hot pig or a hot piece of shellfish, a hot lobster to part of the pot, so we say the whole pot becomes treif. We don't say that the treif only goes into the part of the pot that it touched. We say cham mikzaso cham kulo, and we say the whole pot becomes asa. What about kashering it? Can you simply dip half the pot into the Hagala water and say that since cham mikzaso cham kulo, the hot water takes out all the blias? So the Mechaber says, no, we don't say that. You have to kasher the entire pot. The Ramah says that's true, you have to kasher the whole pot, but only if you use the whole pot for Isser. Like in a normal case, when you use the pot for chametz food, you have to kasher the whole pot. A pot was used for treif, the treif went all over the pot, you have to kasher the whole pot. However, if you know the Ramah says that treif only went on part of the pot, you only have to kasher that part of the pot. The Ramah sounds like he's explaining the Shulchan Aruch. It's a great debate in the Achronim. It's really a machlokes rishonim. Mechaber, not so clear what he holds, but it is a major machlokes rishonim. If only half the keli is treif, half the keli needs kashering, do you have to kasher the whole keli or only part of it? This is a major practical question, because this comes up with things like the handles of pots or parts of pots that you're pretty sure didn't come into contact with food. Do you have to kasher those parts of the keli as well? According to the Ramah, you only have to kasher the part of the keli that comes in contact with food. If you have machines, coffee makers, different types of equipment, and you're pretty sure that only a certain part of the machine came into contact with the tray food, so only that part would have to be kashered according to the Ramah. You only have to kasher the part that was used for the non-kosher food, for the stuff that you're kashering. According to the other opinions, you have to kasher the entire thing. So this is this is a major debate in the poskim, whether you have to kasher the entire keli, even the parts that didn't come in contact with the problematic food. And the poskim point out that the whole discussion here is if you want to kasher only half. You can certainly kasher piecemeal. You can certainly kasher half at a time. Certainly, if the keli is big or unwieldy, you can certainly kasher half, turn around, kasher the other half. The question here is, can you get away with only kashering half, not putting the other half into the kashering medium at all? So that's a major discussion in the Rishonim and Achron. On Daf Ayin Hey, we have the next Mishnah. The Mishnah says that if the Pesach touches, the Pesach is sitting there on the spit, if it bumps into the wall of the tanner, you have to be kolef, you have to shave off a layer, the outer layer of the Pesach becomes unacceptable, you have to shave it off. Notaf meirot v'al acheres, if a little bit of the juice, the gravy from the Pesach touch the cheres, that becomes possible, because now it's tzli al yidei davar acher, it became roasted by the wall of the oven, and then that juice, that liquid, hits the Karban Pesach, yitol es mekomo. You have to be notel, you have to remove that spot. The poskim explain, kidei netila is considerably more than kidei klipa. Kidei klipa, these are both terms that appear in Yeridea, but kidei klipa is a very thin outer layer, a shaving of a thin film off the edge. Kidei netila is much more. Netila is the sheer etzba. It's about an inch. It's almost a couple of centimeters, 1.9 centimeters, according to some. So kidei netila is a substantial amount. You have to remove a thick layer from the rest of the food is kosher, the rest of the food is fine. You have to remove kidei netila. We're about to get into a sugya on Daf Ayin Vav about some of the core key details of how foods are balea, but just to discuss briefly the rule of kidei netila. So sometimes you need shishim. Kidei netila is when two things are hot, or maybe if one thing is hot in some cases, but let's say something's roasting on the fire, like the Pesach, something treif touches it, so the treif causes a layer of kidei netila, a couple of centimeters, an inch or so, on an inch to be aser. Tosfos explains this in Maseches Chulin. Tosfos says that the Gemara talks about, the Mishnah, the Gemara there talks about cooking something with the Gid Hanasha still inside. So Tosfos says that the Gid Hanasha is not kosher, so if you cook the meat together with the Gid Hanasha, you would have to take off kidei netila, an inch around the Gid Hanasha, whichever part of the innards, the inside of the animal was adjacent to the Gid Hanasha, you have to remove kidei netila all around. See, he says maybe only kidei klipa, but he says no. He says we generally don't find klipa. Klipa, we're going to see later in our sugya. Klipa, the more lenient share of klipa applies in limited cases where things are not hot, or the bottom thing is not hot. We'll see. That's when you say klipa. But in general, where everything is hot, when two things are hot, the oven is hot, the meat is hot, the two pieces of meat in the oven, one is treif, one is kosher. Then Tosfos concludes you need at least kidei netila, and that's how we paskin that when two hot things touch. Shulchan Aruch paskins that when two hot things touch, you need kidei netila, which is ovi rochav etzba, and so on. You need kidei netila. Now, often the problem is more than kidei netila. Often, when there is shuman involved, when there is fat, when there's oily or fatty material, when one or both of the items are oily and fat, then that oil can carry the blia throughout the entity, and then you need shishim, and it's not enough to take off kidei netila. Even things that we think are not fat, certainly if they're meat, to certain types of foods, where choshesh are always fatty. So in practice, we're often we're generally going to require shishim keneged the iser, but also kidei netila. Even if you have shishim, for example, let's say the iser is a small amount of iser and the heter is much larger. So a small bit of hot tray food touched a larger quantity of kosher food. You have shishim, so everything is fine. But you still need kidei netila. Maybe it's not considered shuman. You still need kidei netila. Kidei netila is the din of this Mishnah. This Mishnah is telling you the idea of kidei netila, that when two hot things touch, you have to remove kidei netila about 2 centimeters or so from the outer layer of the kosher food that touched the non-kosher food, whether it's juice of the Karban Pesach that became nifsel by touching the wall of the oven, or whether it's any other type of tray food. You have to remove from the kosher food kidei netila wherever it touched the tray food.